All right, so look, here's what's happening within, I just don't want to say the investment banking industry, but politically and throughout the country. Everyone's aware of, quote, the pot issue. And it's kind of fascinating because if you think about it, guys like, me grew up and, in the 60s, and everybody was peace and love and all that stuff. And but it's become kind of a moral debate on Wall Street, whether or not certain investment banking houses will do marijuana deals, or cannabis deals, we should say. But the real big thing coming out is the difference between, and you're going to correct me if I'm wrong, Mark, I'm just telling you from a layman, excuse me, is the difference between recreational cannabis and medical cannabis. And it's becoming quite fascinating because of the size of the industry. I mean, the amount of investment dollars being put into some of these deals is phenomenal. It's here to stay, whether politically you agree or disagree. That's all our own personal preference. Mark has done a hell of a lot of research. He's teaching courses in this industry so people can understand the law. It's becoming very convoluted, especially, within the states. So without any further ado, Marc Ross is a partner in Sichenzia Ross. And I have a bad cold, so forgive me. So with that, Mark, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I am a partner at the firm Sichenzia Ross, Friedman, Ference. Andrea Catania is here, and she's very involved in the organization. And in addition to being a partner at the firm, I'm also teaching the first law school class on marijuana. And I'm teaching that at Hofstra University School of Law. I'm also involved in some of the legislation pending across the country, and I've been speaking a lot on the topic. And basically, it's a very controversial topic, and there are a lot of nuances to it, and frankly, you're not going to understand all the nuances, but I can help elucidate some of them. And it is a murky area because you start off with the oddity where it's a crime under the federal government, yet it is legal in many states, 23 states to be precise. Just before we get started, to correct something that Jim said, the difference between medical marijuana and recreational marijuana is about 30%. If you have a medical card in Colorado, you pay 30% less than if you don't have a card in Colorado. For all intents and purposes, in a lot of people's minds, that's really a difference. You're now trying to see bona fide medical marijuana in a lot of the new states, and there are a lot of bills pending, whether it's Missouri and some of the other states where they're trying to have restrictive bona fide medical marijuana. In New York, where there is legislation that has been passed, it is medical only, and it is the only state in which you can't smoke it. So each state has its own nuances. The issue really that a lot of people in the business world are encountering is you can't cross over state lines with regard to marijuana at all. So let me see how this all works. Push the green button. Look at that, it works. The interesting thing about marijuana is in 1970 it became a controlled substance, which made it a Schedule I drug. And first of all, controlled substance makes it illegal under federal law to manufacture, distribute, or dispense, or possess with intent to manufacture, distribute, or dispense marijuana. So if you're in the marijuana business, meaning you're a grower, aren't you doing that? And the answer is yes. So many times you're violating federal law depending upon what you're doing. So a lot of people, and we'll get to the public markets later, a lot of people put the words in your filings that they're not touching the plant. And then you have all the ancillary businesses that are germane and are not in the quote-unquote marijuana business, and that's really what you're seeing a lot of the companies doing. But there are a lot of them in the business, and we're trying to work with the SEC to change their perception of it. Schedule I drug. The drug or other substance has a high potential for abuse, has no currently accepted medical use and treatment, and lacks accepted safety. Now, Schedule I drug is heroin, LSD, ecstasy, and marijuana. You can't make that stuff up, folks. That really is the dynamic. And that all came about from the Nixon administration, where they started the war on drugs, and actually Nixon commissioned a a blue ribbon commission to look into the issue, and they said it should not be scheduled. So whenever you hear the term scheduled, Schedule 1 makes it a federal crime. They ignored that recommendation, and they put it as a Schedule 1. Schedule 2 is cocaine, Adderall, and everything else like that. So basically, marijuana, they determine, has no medical use, but it's legal in 23 states, which obviously is an oddity. And 23 states have determined that it has medical use. And the other fact that nobody knows is the United States government has a patent on THC. And in connection with getting a patent, you have to articulate what your functionality is, what your benefit is. So the United States government in its patent says what the benefit of medical marijuana is. Notwithstanding, it says there's no medical benefit. As you're starting to see, there are some real quandaries as it relates to this issue. David, if you want to talk on this, you can do this later. 280E. Another interesting nuance is because if it's a crime, you can't deduct your expenses. No deduction or credit shall be allowed for any amount paid or incurred during the taxable year in carrying on any trade or business if such business or trade consists of trafficking in controlled substances. Remember, marijuana is a controlled substance. So depending upon the business that you're in, you may lose the opportunity to take all of your deductions under the federal taxes. Again, an oddity. In addition, because it's illegal in the federal government, you may be denied the opportunity for bankruptcy. There are cases out there, and the cases are really interesting. We've talked about it in my class. There's a case out there in which one of the companies today that's public, and the SEC has allowed a registration statement to go public, a different company, but there was an application for bankruptcy court protection for that company, and the bankruptcy court said you can't go bankrupt because you're not entitled to the benefits of the federal bankruptcy laws because you're engaged in a federal crime. As you can imagine, that makes it very difficult for certain businesses, which is why you see a lot of businesses are private right now. And in terms of the private businesses, they're all trying to figure out what is the next course and how do you go public in it. We're going to talk about that in a minute. But bear in mind, not only do you have an issue where it is currently illegal federally, and it is currently legal in 23 states, but a doctor can't write a prescription for medical marijuana because it's a crime. So the doctor writes a recommendation, which you then take to your dispensary, and then you have your medical marijuana. Now, one of the debates, it's a little bit of a aside, but it's interesting because part of the reason that people think that marijuana is going to really take off as it is because the revenues. I mean, if you look at the amount of revenues that the states have obtained from this bonanza, the next green rush they keep calling it. I mean, Colorado has, I think it was $47 million that fell in its coffers last year. And so the question is now, on the one hand, people want the revenues, but on the other hand, from the state's perspective, if you're treating it like a bona fide medicine, and that's what people really are doing, then how do you tax that? A sin tax, we all understand. Alcohol, tobacco, you know, you could put marijuana in there and then you could charge an excessive sin tax on it. But if marijuana is going to start making it into mainstream society through the medical marijuana, which I think it will, how do you tax that? So that's what a lot of states now are trying to figure out. And the way, you know, since they all want the revenue, there are other ways in doing it. You know, whether you charge a licensing fee and the dispensaries, et cetera, but that's one issue that is really becoming something frequently discussed. And I can tell you point blank, you know, it does work, and I mean, I've been working with a lot of people that have debilitating diseases, and I've been meeting with them, and, you know, I can tell you from firsthand, for whatever that's worth, not scientific, but, you know, medical marijuana really does work. I met with, you may have heard of Charlotte's Web. That was the young girl out in Colorado who had multiple seizures every day, hundreds. And Dr. Shackelford prescribed a low dosage of THC. THC is the hallucinogenic part of marijuana, and CBD, which is the non-hallucinogenic part. And if you do a low THC and a high CBD, it helps children through these debilitating diseases. And so that's where it was getting some traction, except if you read yesterday's Wall Street Journal, somebody took a shot at that and said there's really a lot of unproven evidence of that as well. And as you can imagine, it's controversial because you can't prove it works because it's a federal crime and you can't get the financing, you can't get the NIH approval, and a lot of doctors don't want to be associated with this. The single largest issue that surrounds this is the Department of Justice in August 24th, 2013 came out with a memorandum, and it was furthered in a memorandum on February 14th, 2014, basically outlining 8 steps that you need to adhere to make sure you're compliant. And that became known as the Coal Memorandum. And it was a proclamation by the government, and it was really the government's intention to kind of reiterate that marijuana remains a serious issue and that they're determined to address it. Now, things have changed because you all know that there's not a lot of enforcement of the law now, and that's because of the Department of Justice has said we're not going to enforce it. President Obama in his December 14th, 2014 omnibus spending bill said no money will be used in this bill to implicate people in the states who are doing bona fide medical or recreational marijuana. So people feel comforted by that, but then you also have the fact that the current Attorney General, Loretta Lynch, has said she's opposed to marijuana. And so now the question is what happens when the next president comes in, what happens when the next Attorney General comes in, and obviously from a business perspective, the most important thing is certainty and to really understand what you're dealing with. So some of the Coal Memorandum issues really surround, preventing the distribution to minors, preventing violence of gangs, basically curbing cartels, and then my favorite one, which is preventing drug driving and the exacerbation of other adverse public health consequences associated with marijuana use. In short, they're trying to say the federal government has made a statement, if you adhere to these 8 rules, we will not enforce the federal law because we have limited federal resources and we won't bother you. Now, that memorandum was also incorporated into a FinCEN memo because one issue, it's a banking organization, one issue is banking because banks have trouble taking in cash, taking in money from medical businesses because it's a crime, a federal crime. So the question then comes is how do you get the money from a marijuana business into a bank? There are some banks that are opening up that are trying to do it. They're trying to do state banks. And people are trying to take steps to have that affected. But many banks are still taking the hands off. Probably some of you dealing in securities, some of the clearing firms are making you represent that you're in compliance with what's called the Coal Memo. Those are the Department of Justice memos. That you're in compliance with the Coal Memorandum. And so the FinCEN memo, to make sure that you're complying with the banking issues, you have to do the SARS reports. I don't want to get too boring, but SARS is the suspicious activity reports. And if you think someone is violating the law, you have to report it. It's kind of part of the AML compliance issues. And you have to identify what it is. The first one is you have a limited marijuana exception. If you think it's still okay, but it does deal with marijuana. And then you have you have to provide certain information. Then you have the marijuana priority SARS report, where you think it's significant and you have to report to the government many of the dealings and the actions of the business. And then you have the termination report, which says we can't go forward with this. This is just in violation of federal law. Most banks are FDIC, federally chartered, et cetera. And we don't want to continue on this path. And that's a really big impediment to the industry. Now, how did I get started and interested in this? It really was, I took a due diligence trip out to Colorado where a banker was trying to raise money for a company. And my own perception was don't waste your money. I think it's BS. And then they turned around and said, we'd like you to come out and do the due diligence trip and look at the company with us. I said once, I'll say it again, don't waste your money, I think it's BS. And then they said the magic words that every lawyer likes to hear, I'll pay you. So I went out there, and I couldn't believe how bona fide and real and sophisticated the business was in Colorado. I mean, really where they are mainstreaming it. I mean, to me, the most interesting thing was we've all seen them make ice cream in front of you. They're making marijuana in front of you. They're doing scientific research with local universities. They're straining it. They're really everything about it, and they're trying to make it into a bona fide business. And I think what you'll see is you're seeing it now in Colorado, where it went kind of really far to the left, pardon the expression, and it's starting to get curved back. You're seeing it now in some of the local ordinances where they're trying to get the marijuana shops outside, not every single store in the middle of town, but trying to put it on the outside. There was an article last week in Washington State where it is legal. It's legal in 4 states. You have Washington, Colorado, Alaska, and Washington, Colorado, Oregon. No. Alaska, Washington, Colorado, and no, it's not California. Colorado. Okay, so that's it. Colorado. And you know, so in Washington, they were saying some of the local municipalities now are not allowing the shops to come into it because they're relying on federal law. It is so kooky now. You have some of the states, Oklahoma and Nebraska, are suing Colorado because they're trying to enforce the federal law. You have reports out in Utah, which I couldn't make this up if I tried, where a DEA agent said, if you allow marijuana to be legal here, you'll have stoned rabbits because they'll be eating the wildlife, and once they eat the wildlife, they'll eat the marijuana and they'll just be stoned. I mean, the information you really have on all of this is crazy. But there are currently public companies in the marijuana space, and the interesting thing about that is, you know, in dealing with the SEC on those, which we do, sometimes the SEC is not declaring them effective like they do in the ordinary registration statement. When you file an acceleration request and they say, okay, you could be effective in 48 hours. Instead, they're relying on a nuanced Rule 8A and saying you can go effective after 20 days automatically. Now, some people debate whether that should give you comfort, as whether the SEC will take the position that since they let you go effective, is that different than declaring you effective? The answer is maybe, but in any event, you're currently effective. I think there used to be much more taint associated with the marijuana, and yes, it's called cannabis, that's the fancy term for it, but I think you're seeing a lot more, you know, people accepting it. A lot more bankers are interested in it. And one of the things that we're doing is we're working with some of the clearing firms to get them comfortable in accepting the certificates. And we all know that clearing firms are having trouble accepting certs all the time anyway. In terms of the business, I'm trying to work with the regulators. We're working with some of the states, and some of the state legislation that we're working with excuse me, requires the states to petition the federal government to change the law. So the law being that it is a federal crime. If it just goes from Schedule 1 to Schedule 2, it's no longer a prohibited crime. It's like Adderall. Adderall is a Schedule 2. Oxycontin is a Schedule 2. The FDA becomes involved. It's not an out-and-out prohibition. You can have more research with the federal government can sponsor it. Universities that receive federal aid can sponsor it. It would make more sense. People are thinking whether Obama would do that before he leaves office. My personal view is he won't, because he doesn't want to be remembered as the pot president, because there's an argument, some people think he's acting unilaterally anyway, but I'll leave politics aside. There's an argument that he can take it from a Schedule 1 to a Schedule 2. And that is when you hear the words about scheduling, that's what they mean by scheduling. So right now you have a couple of companies that are in the growing business or peripherally related to the growing business. You have a land business. You have someone making it indoors, and those all have effective registration statements. You have a social network for cannabis users. and that company is following an S1. You don't have anyone who's actually done an IPO or an initial offering, but you do have effective selling shareholder registration statements. And I think what's going to happen over time, and we've been speaking with the SEC, is you're going to have more people going public, and especially because you have more funds that are being formed to fund it. Obviously, everybody heard about Peter Thiel. He put millions into the privateer. It's the $75 million round at privateer. He put undisclosed millions into it, so that brought additional credibility to the industry. I think you see a lot more banks are interested in it. I'd like to think that's why these folks asked me to speak on it, because they see their clients are all coming forward and asking a lot of questions about it. And you know, there's no doubt, in my mind at least, and I've kind of hitched myself to this, so I'm certainly putting my money where my mouth is, that this is an area that's going to be explosive. I mean, it's not often in America you see a brand new burgeoning industry. I mean, many of us who went over to China when they were just exploring capitalism 10 years ago, it was kind of exciting to see. But here you have it in the States. This is a source of revenue. My favorite joke is, you know, the governments are going to get addicted to the revenue. And it really is a tremendous source of revenue. I mean, every calculation is this is $1 trillion industry, and the money is just, you know, off the charts in terms of, you know, how it can be developed. And I think it will be developed, and I think if it's done carefully and if it's done wisely, because, you know, we all know that when you're a public company, you have all kinds of potential pitfalls, and you have to be very mindful. And certainly, you know, we would all suggest you speak to good counsel and good accountants and good advisors, but when you're in this space, you have a potential double whammy. If anybody has any questions, I'm more than happy to answer them, or at least try to answer them. Yes, sir.
What do you think about the future for getting listed on exchanges?
What do I think about the future of getting listed on the exchanges? The answer is yes. I think the exchanges turn around and tell you right now that they're very happy to list you, and I think it reminds me of China, where you had the two different, and if anybody's here from the exchanges, I apologize in advance, where you had the marketing arm running around to all the Chinese companies saying, please list with us, and then you have the compliance arm running around behind the back saying, get the hell out of here. So right now, the exchanges are suggesting that they're amenable to it. We've met with them, we've spoken with them. You know, when it comes down to it, I'd like to see whether they are. Certainly, you know, most of the companies today are listed on the OTC markets and the bulletin board, but I think some of these companies that you have coming up that have raised substantial revenues and are really going to go to the next level, I think they're going to knock on the door. And I can tell you, we've had meetings and there have been reception, but again, I'm cautiously optimistic. Any other questions? Please.
Can you comment on all of this with respect to the FDA? Because there are pharmaceutical companies that are pursuing.
Right, GH Pharma. To me, it's what, I beg your pardon. Can I comment on, sorry?
Can you repeat his question?
I'm going to. Can I comment on the fact that some of the pharmaceuticals companies, including GW Pharma, has done research with regard to cannabis? And it seems to be, I guess your question is, can I comment on it, meaning, isn't it hypocritical? So the answer is yes. And I think part of what it really is, it's a reflection of the dilemma. So that's one possibility is that's a big company. Big companies can do it. You know, I think what you're going to start to see is, you know, private companies can do that, okay, and there's not an issue there. I think what you're going to start to see is those larger pharma companies. I mean, people are concerned that big tobacco and all these big pharma are waiting on the sides because, as far as I'm concerned, you will have medical marijuana in this country, you know, in the next 6 years. And I think it'll come from the influences of big pharma. And I think some of the research they're doing is very good. And the research they're doing, just to explain it technically for just a minute, is, I mean, the part about marijuana has a bad rap because Colorado medical marijuana is a farce, okay? I shouldn't say it like that, I'm sorry. It's not exactly done in a medicinal way, because the difference between, as I said, the difference between medical marijuana in Colorado and recreational marijuana in Colorado is 30%. You have the card, you pay less. But real medical marijuana and the stuff that's being done by the pharmaceutical companies has CBDs, which is the cannabinoids, and how they interact with the THC and how much they vary from this to that. And that's really what medicine is supposed to be about, and that's what people's issue with marijuana has always been. It's medical marijuana. I have a problem. Smoke a joint and come back in the morning. That's not medicine. But when you give a prescription like they did for Charlotte's Web for kids, where it's a low THC dosage, it's a high CBD dosage, and there are other variables as well, and they all work together as a medicine, just like Vicodin, just like OxyContin, it works that way. So the short answer is I think they're doing it the right way, and I think people will get the residual benefit from it. Please. Absolutely. Do I think the FDA can ever approve a drug? No. Right now, I think the FDA, right now, I think it would be, well, yes, I do, because they do Marinol. Marinol's an approved drug, and that has THC. So the answer is yes, I think they can. Anybody? Anything else? Please. 2 questions is all you get.
Can you comment on how the laws affect Indian reservations and how they're able to make use of banking stuff?
You obviously sat in my class because we talked about that two classes ago. Amongst other things, the Department of Justice came out with a memorandum allowing for the Indian reservations, if they comply with the Coal Memo, which is the Department of Justice 1 through 8, that I skipped over, that I mentioned briefly, and they have said that the Indian reservations, because they're tribal lands, if they adhere to it, meaning they're not going to make it accessible to minors, they're not going to cross state lines on it, they can have dispensaries as well. Now, the Indian reservations, as many of you probably know, have very high unemployment, very high drug abuse. So many of the Indian reservations are opposed to it, but shockingly, the Northeast and Northwest reservations are in favor of it. You know, Mohegan is doing some interesting testing into it and exploration of it. And in fact, the first Indian conference was held last month in Seattle. So it is legal, it is available. One of the things that people are looking into is the banking issue, is can you bank on the reservation? And it certainly is a difficult issue. Colorado recently had a bank that was a state-chartered bank, and they waited for the federal to give approval for it, and they kicked it up the chain, and the Fed didn't even sign off for a while. I don't even know if they have signed off yet on it, to give permission for the bank, even the state-chartered bank, to exist, because they're going to go through the federal currency. So whether they can open up a bank on the reservation is an open question. A lot of people are looking into that. Certainly they can open up dispensaries on the reservation, and the federal government says they will give them a pass on that, just like they'll give a pass on the states who are compliant with, you know, the memorandum and the regulations. But, you know, just like yesterday in the class we had people were talking about businesses. One person in my class, one group, came up with this business of opening up a dispensary on the Shinnecock Reservation out in the Hamptons, because people who drive from Manhattan out to the Hamptons, actually you can't take this is proprietary, but you know, you stop off, you buy your cigarettes, it's 40% less than what you would get in the stores, and you know, because the reservations have their own tax issues. For example, and you can ask David afterwards, you probably won't have the same tax problems if you're on the reservation running a dispensary that you would if you're running a dispensary out in other states, because you don't have those federal restraints. So the irony then is you have a leg up, and the irony also is that the bad dispensaries, quote unquote, those that don't take the proper deductions, that do take the deductions that would ordinarily be proper, but since it's marijuana isn't proper, are substantially more profitable than the compliant dispensaries that don't take the deduction and have a much higher cost of operations. So that's kind of one of those tragic ironies. Any other questions? Michael Siegel, you have any questions? Just kidding. Anyway, if that's it, thank you all very, very much.